We good to go? Can you hear me? I hope so. If not, it's Dawn's fault. Just kidding. Just kidding. She'll yell at me later. So welcome tonight to an amazing event. As you know, back in October, this started a little further than that, but back in October, we had a meeting. And, it's exciting to see where we were to where we are today. And the presentation tonight is going to show you a lot. There's a lot of information. So you can write some notes down. We're going to have time for questions and so forth. But let me go ahead and start the process. So thanks for coming. I appreciate everybody coming out on this Thursday night. Back in, like I said, back in October, we announced a major step in our long-term plan to address the issues we have with stormwater and tidal flooding. That's very important to understand the two. For years and years and years, we've always talked about tidal. And what's exciting about this plan, there's three areas that I'm going to read off. But adding in the storm water is huge. Anywhere you go, you're talking about tidal. You're hear tidal anywhere you go, sea level rises, tidal issues. But what I'm so proud about this plan is that it's a holistic approach. And really, when you look at this plan, it's starting Greenwood and going east versus normally focusing just on the flats or on Atlantic or Annapolis or Bay or, along the waterfront area. And that's what's so significant about this meeting tonight. And what the plan is that Bayland has done is that we're going to address all the issues. But let me go ahead and put a disclaimer in. There's a lot of great information in this plan, and it's not going to happen overnight. Everything that we're going to talk about, everything we're going to learn over the years is going to take something that we all know, and that's money. So with our relationships in Annapolis, with grants, with you name it, reaching out to everybody and anybody, we're going to put this plan in place as time goes on. It's not going to happen overnight, so please be patient. Don't call me a year from now and say, what happened? It's going to take time. But years, we would go after a grant or go after funding, and they would say, well, we can't give you money because you don't have a plan. Well, guess what? We have a plan. So there are three areas that they want to focus. One is conducting comprehensive assessment of the entire town when it comes to flood resiliency, from drainage systems to road elevations and infrastructure capacity. The entire town, Greenwood to the Bay, First Street to the non-tidal wetlands, the entire town. Two, develop recommendations to help ease the problems this flooding causes to our homes and businesses and quality of life. And three, come back and give us the results of their assessments, including recommendations for how to fix our flooding problems. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome back our friends from Bayland, Megan Barney. Did I get it? Barnett. I even wrote it down. Anna Johnson, to tell us what they've learned in all three areas. I even practiced that. Megan and Anna are the senior project leaders on this study. They will give us the top line findings of the study and answer questions. The complete study, all 200 pages, in their PowerPoint presentation will be found, could be found. I'm not sure if it's there yet, but I think after our meeting will be provided on the flood committee page of the town website. We wanted these guys to give the presentation, then the questions can come in. We'll take questions for as long as there's time tonight. But if you want to send in your questions or something occurs to you later that you might want to ask, you can email your questions to us via two email addresses. One, dbowen@northbeachmd.org. And then one is lkabler@northbeach.org. Get your questions in. We're going to leave it open until May 1st to receive all of the questions. So please get them in. They will be answered back to you ASAP. And then the most relevant questions and so forth will go onto the website. Remember, this is the start. Even though they've been working hard for many, many months, this is still the start of the process, something we've never seen before. I'm excited about it. I think this is a heck of a first step. I look forward to putting the plan in place. With that, in turn, I'd like to turn everything over to Megan and Anna. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, you can just go to the next slide. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to Bayland for any of you that weren't with us back in October. We are an environmental engineering firm that's been in business since 1995. And our company has three core groups. We have stream and ecological restoration, stormwater management and sustainable site development, and marine dredging and shoreline. So a project like this, compound flooding, coastal stormwater, it's in the core of what we do. So we're very passionate about this work. As the mayor introduced the project team, I'm Megan Bernay, the senior project manager. Anna's a coastal engineer and climate change professional for Bayland, and Sapar Baharlu, a founding principal, has been doing the QA/QC behind the scenes for us.
Right now, I'm trying to fix
Okay.
it right now.
That's fine. Yep. So tonight, we'll give a brief summary of what we talked about in October, and then we'll get into the vulnerability assessment that was performed and how we prioritize the high priority areas. And then we'll discuss the flood mitigation strategies we looked at for each area. And these mitigation strategies involve coastal flooding, stormwater flooding, and also management strategies. And we'll talk about the alternatives analysis that looked at all of these strategies. And then we'll get into the implementation plan and some potential funding opportunities for implementation. So back in October, or I guess back in late summer, early fall, when we started this project, it started with field investigations where Bayland had two people, myself included, literally walk the entire town, Greenwood to Atlantic, the 1st to 12th. We verified the as-built provided by the town for stormwater mapping, and we located any additional structures that we found. We were looking for green infrastructure BMP locations, whether it be town alleys or town open space parcels, or even just privately owned open space parcels. We mapped all the coastal infrastructure. And then we went back to the office, and with some LiDAR topographic information, we put together an existing conditions base map. And then we identified the critical elevations we wanted our survey crew to come out and pick up, which was essential for our concept design development and also our flooding analysis, both stormwater and coastal. So once the survey crews did their critical elevation survey, we did a coastal flooding analysis, and then we also did a stormwater flooding analysis. And that analysis helped us identify some initial priority areas of concern. And then at that point, we opened it up to the town, both before, during, and after the meeting, to identify some additional priority areas. And that's where we left it off last October. And I'll turn it over to Anna about how we did the vulnerability assessment.
Okay, so since October, what we've been working on is we basically had all the areas together that the citizens gave input on. The town flood committee kind of pointed us in the direction of which areas we need to focus our attention on. And so we looked at each of those areas and evaluated their vulnerability to flooding. So evaluating vulnerability means looking at the three components of vulnerability, one being exposure. So each area, how exposed is it to the risk of flooding? Secondly, we looked at the sensitivity to flooding. So that's kind of, the damages or the consequences if that particular area floods. So a developed area like North Beach tends to have pretty high consequences if flooding occurs. An area like a marsh, for instance, marshes, may have some damage, but then they bounce back pretty quickly. So that's why marshes and green infrastructure are typically considered less sensitive to flooding and are usually preferred alternatives because of that reason. And then finally, we look at adaptive capacity of the area. And what adaptive capacity is how easily an area can adapt to changing conditions due to climate change or flood risk or anything like that. So the example I like to give for adaptive capacity is a pier, for instance. A fixed pier, if it goes underwater, then it's flooded. A floating pier, it doesn't matter what the elevation of the water is, it floats up and down. So that has a high adaptive capacity versus the fixed pier having a low adaptive capacity. So for each area, we looked at those three components, and then we came up with the cumulative vulnerability for each one. And so we gave it, each area either got a very high, a high, medium, or a low ranking of vulnerability. And based on that, you can go to the next slide. So based on that, we developed this prioritization table. So what this is we taking the vulnerability that we calculated, and then in conversations with the flood committee about some intrinsic or, non-quantifiable impacts of flooding, such as, for instance, we can look at an area and say, okay, you're going to have standing water here for 4 hours, which is more than the 2 hours somewhere else. But if that other area can back up traffic for, if it's the main road and it backs up traffic, that may be more impactful to the residents than the area that floods for 4 hours, for instance. So those kinds of conversations, that input was important in developing this table, but this is where we ranked all the areas that we looked at. And I'm just going to very briefly tell you which the areas are. So ranked first was 7th Street between Bay and Atlantic. Second was 5th Street between Chesapeake and Bay. Third was Atlantic Avenue. Fourth was, oh gosh, I can't, 9th Street. Sorry, I couldn't see for a second. 5th Street was Bay Avenue between 5th and 7th. 6th came out as Annapolis Avenue. 7th was Chesapeake between 4th and 6th Street. 8th is Dayton Avenue between 3rd and 6th Street. 9th was 1st Street between Chesapeake Avenue and Bay Avenue. 10th was Frederick Avenue between 3rd and 4th. And then 11th was Greenwood Avenue. I can't read that far, sorry. And then 12th was Burnt Oaks North Apartments. And then 13th was kind of a combination of all the other areas so that we could at least propose solutions for those areas as well. The next slide. So after we ranked the areas, we started coming up with mitigation strategies. So this kind of touches on what we showed in October. We gave some brief kind of strategies that we were thinking, and then we kind of solidified them into this. So I'll present what the coastal flooding mitigation strategies we developed were. The first being a seawall and revetment. And this is proposed in areas like Atlantic Avenue, where you're going to have flooding from tides going over the wall, or going over the existing revetment and onto the road. And you're also going to have waves that crash and bring a volume of water onto there. So the seawall and revetment there, just a plain old seawall in other areas like the beach area where you don't have waves because your waves are already broken by the structures that you have out in the water. An earthen berm. So there's an existing earthen berm now at the end of Annapolis along 9th Street. We're proposing raising it for future conditions and then building a new one north or east of Bay Avenue, kind of where that other marsh area is by 10th Street. And then finally, this stop log, which is a structure that, when you have a wall, but you still need to be able to walk through. It's kind of like a watertight door. So it can be open when there's no flooding conditions and closed when there is a flooding condition. So now Megan will present the stormwater mitigation strategies.
So just about every priority area where stormwater flooding was a concern, storm drain infrastructure improvements are proposed, and these are increasing the capacity of the pipes. So in some instances, we don't have the elevation to make the pipe bigger, so you can propose pipes in parallel. Other solutions include increasing the storm drain inlet like catch basin, making the grate so it can collect more water more quickly. And so all of these improvements will help collect more runoff quickly and convey it out. So when the tides go down, the water can discharge easily. Instances where the outfall is at a lower elevation, tide gate valves are proposed. This will prevent the tidal waters back watering into the storm drain pipes. So that way, when it rains, the stormwater can flow, and the hydrostatic pressure within the system will push the valve open and discharge the water when the tides are lower. In a couple instances, particularly one area of 9th Street, we noticed that the road was several inches to a foot lower than the adjoining driveways. So this area the roadway could be raised, and that will, one, prevent coastal flooding, and then also it gives us more capacity beneath the roadway to increase the storm drain infrastructure. When storm drain infrastructure improvements and elevating roadways and tide valves still don't solve the problems, the next step we look at is underground storage vaults. They're a little more costly, so that's why we don't go to them first. They're just a big concrete box underground. They provide more storage. And then finally, when an area still needs further flood reduction, then we look at pumping stations. Our model did consider the new 5th Street pump station, so all the improvements were already considering that pump station. And then we looked at upgrading the 9th Street pump station and also proposed a new pump station at 7th Street. And then within each of the areas, we identified areas where we could have green infrastructure. These help collect the first flush of runoff, and they also provide an aesthetic look to the area. And the other good thing about when you can incorporate green infrastructure, they make a grant application much more friendly. The next mitigation strategy is what we call management mitigation strategies. And sorry, not order. These are items like ordinances, incorporating new or revising current. So the Maryland Coast Smart Council developed a regulation for construction and reconstruction within flood-prone areas. So the town could consider a similar ordinance. It can also update development codes or permit application requirements to include flooding assessment due to potential climate change. This would help not only ensure the proposed development would be safe against flooding, but also that it's not going to adversely impact adjacent areas for flooding. Another management strategy is participation in FEMA's community rating system. This is a voluntary program where if you implement mitigation strategies above and beyond what they require for their national flood insurance program, property owners are then allowed to get lower insurance premiums. And they have a very detailed manual outlining the program, the credit calculations, the documents required online for those that may be interested in looking into that. Another option is creating a staff position. As we'll get into, our implementation plan includes 17 projects. So that's quite a large effort to take on. And so this staff position would be paid through for grant funds. And the position would include creating bids for design, permitting, and construction of the projects, but then they could also oversee the operation and maintenance once the projects are implemented. Management strategies also include educational outreach. One, educating homeowners that even minor improvements on your property can adversely impact your neighbor. We see this time and time again where someone puts in a patio or a landscaping feature and they don't realize that they're cutting off the flow path and then their neighbors are flooding. The program can also emphasize and encourage property owners to implement their own little BMPs to help reduce flooding. And for the landowners that are interested in implementing those microscale practices, it could connect landowners with grant opportunities. So that way you're not on the hook for all the money to pay for that practice. And the town could look at land acquisition for highly vulnerable properties. This has a dual benefit. It moves critical infrastructure outside of flood areas and also could provide an open space for implementing flood reduction strategies. And I'll turn it back to Anna to talk about the alternatives now.
Okay, so taking all the strategies that we discussed, then we went back to our 12 areas and we did an alternatives analysis to determine what's going to be the best option for each area. So to determine the alternatives, we used the 4 types of risk management strategies, which is also called the 4 T's of risk management, and it's applicable whether you're talking about flooding or you're talking about finances. It's just the principal approach to handling risk. So the first one is to tolerate risk. This is the same as a do nothing alternative or a business as usual, evaluating what would happen if we just accepted the risk and didn't do anything moving forward. The second strategy is to terminate the risk. So what do we have to do in order to absolutely eliminate the risk, prevent flooding from happening altogether? What type of effort would that be? Third option is transfer the risk. So this is kind of anytime you buy insurance, that this is risk transfer. You're basically paying a third party to take on the risk for you. And finally, treat the risk is risk reduction or risk mitigation, where you're implementing strategies for helping reduce the risk, but understanding that it's not a complete prevention of the risk. So each of the areas was evaluated based on these 4 alternatives. And the next slide will just give an example for 7th Street. 7th Street was the highest ranked area. And so I just wanted to give an example of kind of, if you go into the report, you will see the details of all of it. It's about 250 pages of fun if you're needing something to do this evening. But it does kind of detail everything that we looked at for all the areas. But for 7th Street, for instance, we looked at, okay, if we tolerate the risk, what would that look like at 7th Street between Bay and Atlantic? And also we use 2050. So this is a resiliency study. So we're looking at future conditions, not necessarily what's happening today, but what are conditions going to be like in 2050. And so in 2050, stormwater flooding from storms could have water on the road for 18 hours plus. Storm surge from tidal storms could result in flooding of multiple feet. The road itself could be perpetually backwatered. So as Megan described, that's when the tidal water actually enters in through the pipe and travels back and floods the road, even though the road is not, on the shoreline. And even though the other parts of the shoreline may not, or the other parts of the area between may not be flooded, you will get perpetual backwatering. So that means water kind of has the potential to always be standing on the road here. And then finally, just your regular old high tide or unusually high water level could cause flooding on this road multiple times a month by 2050. So that was the tolerate the risk. Next, we looked at, okay, if we want to terminate the risk, what do we have to do to completely eliminate flooding on this in 2050 conditions? So, well, we would have to build a seawall along Atlantic. And that seawall would have to be to about elevation of +11. So right now, if you imagine the Jersey barriers are about +6, so imagine 5 feet on top of that is what you would have to build in order to stop flooding completely from entering onto 7th Street, storm surge flooding. The berms, the current berm that is out there is about +4. It would have to be raised to +7 to prevent flooding. And then the new berm that we would be proposing east of Bay Avenue along close to 10th Street would also have to be to +7. And then the storm drain pipes would have to be increased to approximately 3 times their current size, and a pump station would need to be added. And if you did all that, then you wouldn't have flooding on 7th Street. So the next alternative we looked at, discussed was risk transfer. And unfortunately, in 2050 conditions, it's probably flooded too much for insurance to be feasible. So we didn't investigate that option further. And then so finally, we looked at treating the risk. So what can we do to reduce the risk, but not totally prevent it? So we say, okay, well, what if we build a seawall along Atlantic Avenue, but we make it just to 6.5? So just about at the same elevation as the Jersey rails or the Jersey barriers are right now. And then we raise the existing earthen berm and build another earthen berm. And then to treat the stormwater flooding, we can just install some storage vaults and add a pump station. So those were the three alternatives we looked at. We put them into the table over there on the right is a decision matrix. So the decision matrix is where it helps us make our decisions, exactly what it says. And so we set criteria. And in this particular case, we looked at, okay, what's the feasibility of implementing these solutions, the efficiency or effectiveness, the social economic impact, the environmental impact, and then the cost. And we gave each alternative a rating based on that. And the numbers are the higher, the better. And so it came out that probably treating the risk is the best option for this particular area. So we did that for all the sites. And then in the next slide, it led us to develop this implementation plan. So because a lot of the projects that we're proposing are going to treat the flooding in multiple areas, we could just come up with projects that would address them. And then we categorize the projects based on in what urgency they need to be implemented. So we base it off immediate implementation, midterm implementation, and then long-term implementation. So the immediate implementation are the projects that are going to address the flooding in the top ranked areas that we showed in the prioritization table. And then the midterm implementation is kind of projects that the impacts are probably not going to start happening maybe for a few more years with climate change. So we could possibly wait a little bit to start implementing those projects. And then long-term implementation are projects that could potentially have issues in 2050, but they probably need to be reassessed between now and then to kind of make sure. But we do have some solutions for those particular areas that were ranked pretty low on the prioritization table. And so going to the immediate implementation, I just want to clarify that immediate implementation is, our recommendation that you get started on these projects now, but, between searching for funding and designing and permitting and everything else that happens, the goal is kind of to have these projects in place in the next 10 to 15 years. If they're in the ground in 10 to 15 years, you can start seeing the benefits of them. And that can improve the quality of life for the residents. So there's 7 projects. They're listed here. There's no particular order. As you can see, the price tag on implementing some of these can be as low as $50,000 and as high as $8 million. So absolutely, it's based on, initiatives, funding, availability of materials and equipment. So there's lots of things that go in. So we don't want to tell you to go do project 1, 2, 3. We're just recommending that these 7 projects be done first to benefit more of the areas. And so all those projects have a total price tag of about $11 or $12 million. And then in the midterm implementation, those are projects we believe should start in the next 10 to 15 years so that they can be in the ground providing benefits in about 20 years. And there's 8 of those. And all these projects are both, some of them are stormwater, some of them are coastal. They have components of both. And that has a budget of just under $7 million for the midterm implementation. And then, like I said, the long-term implementation still need to be reassessed in the future, but there are solutions that can be implemented, and that's another $3 million. So now that I've given you the costs and all the numbers, Megan's going to come tell you how to pay for it.
How is the town going to come up with this money? Luckily, there are multiple federal and grant opportunities available. Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has quite a few. The first is their Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. That's more for once a disaster is declared, so it might not be too feasible, but in the event it happens, it's an option. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant provides funding for projects that reduce or eliminate flooding to buildings that have flood insurance through their NFIP program. Then the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities BRIC, as it's called, is probably going to be the most applicable FEMA grant, where it provides funding for hazard mitigation projects that reduce risks from natural hazards such as compound flooding. And then MDE also has cost sharing through its comprehensive flood management grant program. And so for the town's capital improvement projects that are within this plan, they will provide cost sharing. So say you get 75% through FEMA, they could provide up to another 25% to help round out the project. Housing and Urban Development has a couple funding programs that are detailed in the plan. And then National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, they have multiple avenues for projects that provide coastal zone flood protection. They do typically require incorporation of restoration or habitat. So that element would need to be incorporated to flood protection design in order for that grant to be applicable. And then NRCS has multiple initiatives to help communities reduce from flooding. And if grants are starting to become scarce or not funding projects completely, there's also loans and municipal bonds that could also be applied for. And with that, we'll conclude the presentation and open it up to questions. Yes. Correct. So it would. Well, vaults are more expensive because they require structural design. So if we looked to vaults when we can't increase the pipe capacity. And in some cases, it's a combination of both. But yes, that's where they're proposed. Oh, sorry, I was supposed to repeat the question. Would we do the pipes and the vaults? So the question is, would it be more cost effective to have just the vault instead of increasing the pipe so we can use existing pipes? Yes, but it would probably require a larger vault. So that's why when you get into the detailed design and permitting, that would kind of be the analysis that would be done at that time, kind of finding that the cost benefit analysis of pipe improvements versus vault. So the question is, if you do the wall along Atlantic and don't do anything else, is the water just gonna go around it?
Yeah, sure. So absolutely. The one thing, like when she was presenting the grants, if you're looking at preventing storm surge or tidal flooding, you have to have a closed system because obviously water will find a hole and go in there and you haven't solved your problem. So when we presented in the implementation plan, we have the structures kind of broken out. So we have, okay, you can do the seawall in front of Atlantic and then do the earthen berm. So there's so that seawall would have to come around and tie into that existing earthen berm right there. And then if you do that, then you can have protection for up to 4 feet of, because right now Atlantic is quite low and the wall is quite low, or the Jersey barriers aren't really flood barriers, because they have holes in it and everything. And, so right now, when you build that seawall and you tie it into the earthen berm there, then you're already going to win yourself a couple more years until you have time to go back and fix that earthen berm and build the other earthen berm. So yes, but you're right that all tidal flooding, where you're talking about storm surge or high tides, it has to be a closed system. And usually you won't get grant funding unless you can prove to them that you have closed your system, because you don't want to just build a wall here, pay for building a wall here, and then water just comes in on the sides. So I think we talked with Donnie, and there was some raising that was done. But yes, if you look at the figure for that particular area, there we would have to bump the road up as well. So you'll basically have seawall that ties into the earthen berm, and then that ties into the road, which would have to be elevated to the same elevation. So if you're driving down Bay, entering into the town, you would go over kind of a little hump before going down, and then that would act like a barrier. And then further down the line, when you're talking about even higher water levels, you could build the other earthen berm that's going to go around that other marsh and totally close this. And then that's going to tie into elevations of like +10 at the northern, like the northwestern part of the town. So then you would have a completely closed system there. They do, but like I said, the projects are separated, because if you just did the seawall and you tied it into the earthen berm, you could have protection till 2040, for instance. Maybe not 2040, maybe 2035, whatever, depending on sea levels, how they rise, storm events, that kind of thing. So we're not saying you have to do it all in one go, because that earthen berm's already at a +4. So it's already providing significantly more protection than Atlantic Avenue has. So you don't have to do them at the same exact time. But if you want to reach the 2050, we recommend that they be done to close the system by 2050.
His question was that when the flooding has occurred, it has backed up through the outfalls. And so the first thing that should be done should be backflow preventers on 7th Street. So as part of the 7th Street improvements, we are actually proposing a pump station, and whether it would have a lower outfall with a duckbill or pump out and over like the new 5th Street, either scenario would protect against the backwatering. Mhm. So the question is, where would the berm terminate?
Yeah, you're correct. It would stop at 10th Street. Because once you hit 10th Street, like you start getting higher elevations in general. I think that area tends to be, +9, +10. And so that's sufficient. So we would stop it there.
So the question is, how is the stormwater going to be addressed for, what was the exact area?
Well, it's the
There are improvements proposed on Dayton.
okay.
Mhm. It's not in that order. It's not in
Yeah.
that order.
It's not, we're not saying do the burn second. We're saying just do it. Yeah.
Right, right, but
As part of the berm design, there will be outflows.
okay.
Yeah, whenever we stop water, we obviously provide an outflow for it. Okay. Would the state help pay for? Would this,
That actually, that's part of the state house. Lobby, the town lobby to get that done.
Okay, the first question in the chat is there any possibility of working with the county to share costs since a lot of the water is coming from the county land?
that, the town would try and coordinate with the county, and the report does talk about the upland drainage from the county.
Okay. Next question is, can you talk about and show where the proposed earthen dam northwest of Bay Avenue will be?
There is an image in the plan.
Yeah, I was gonna. So, just so you know, the report has images for all, 12 areas. We obviously did want to share those in the presentation. But if
We'd
you,
be here all night.
yeah, but if you look at, for instance, figure 44 in the report, you can see there's a pink line that shows that where that proposed berm would go.
Okay. So the report will be on the town website tomorrow for the people that are wondering about that. The third question is, have any renderings been done to see how the seawall would look visually? It seems like it would be a tall wall around the town blocking the bay views.
So there are typical sections provided in the report. But as Anna's presentation said, the wall's not going to be built to that +11. The recommendation was to treat and build it to +6.5. So it really would only be a few inches higher than the existing Jersey barrier wall.
Okay. And the last question is in regards to the estimated costs, are you aware of how accurate the estimates are to final costs for any previous projects?
They're planning level costs. So we base them on our catalog of bid documents, and then we do add some contingencies. Knowing that these projects aren't going to be implemented for quite a few years. So they're just more planning level costs to give the town and grants funders an idea of how much money would be needed.
Right, so yeah, I just want to second that this has to go through design. We haven't done accurate quantities. We don't know what soil conditions are. There's lots of things that the design would kind of hash out so you could get a more accurate estimate. But yeah, as Megan said, these are definitely planning levels going after grant funding type accuracy.
Mayor said you need a plan to get anywhere, and this is that plan. Next step would be detailed design and permitting for these projects.
I don't have any other questions in the chat.
Audience?
Okay, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks everyone for showing up here and online. As Dawn said, the report will be on the town website at the flood committee page, correct, tomorrow. And I think we're giving a few weeks until May 1st for comments. Send them to me or Donnie, comments or questions, and we'll get back to you and send our comments on to Bayland. With that, I think we'll close. Thank you very much.